Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sales Stories with Nate Teske. I'm your host, Nate Teske, and with me today is Rob Sullivan, my co-host. And collectively, Rob and I have nearly 70 years of professional sales experience. So we've got a lot of stories, a lot of exciting content that we like to cover with our customers and former contacts. And today we have this is actually my first customer that we're interviewing. His name is Dion Rooney. So, Dion, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nate and Rob. Great to be here, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation this morning.
Yeah, this has been super fun, Dion, and I think this is our sixth or seventh podcast that we're doing, and they're kind of gelling, so to speak. But as I mentioned, as we got started here, you're the first customer that we're interviewing, and two things I wanted to point out about that. Part of the reason that we even started this podcast and are doing it was about a couple of years ago. Dion had reached out to me and said, "Hey, your former employer is looking to hire me to be an ambassador and to reach out to my network of contacts that I've worked with over the last 35 plus years and basically engage those companies, talk about the service, and have a warm connection type thing." And I was talking to him. I said, "Well, what's the reason you're doing it?" And one of the things you said, Dion, was, "I'm really excited to reconnect with my network." So even though that was like 2 years ago, as I thought about that, and Rob and I started talking about doing a podcast, I'm thinking that would be pretty fun, right? Going back in time, talking to people that I used to work with and customers and things of that nature. So kudos to you for that. And secondarily, the other piece of it is you have a unique background, Dion, because not only have you been on the buyer side for the majority of your career, but the last couple of years you spent proactively working to sell the service. So you have a unique background in the sense of you've been on the sales side and on the client side. And I'm super excited for the stories we're going to discuss today because I know just in talking to you, you've had some that were pretty cool that you told me years ago when we worked very closely together. So welcome to the show and super excited to have you on today.
Likewise, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, so Dion, the way we like to start these discussions is talking about, a really exciting or really interesting or just good sales experience you had. And if you'd like to talk about one when you were actually in the sales process recently, with what you're most recently doing, or if you'd like to talk about it from a client side where you were the customer, I think it'd be great for listeners to hear, both pieces. And then if you'd also like to discuss maybe a more challenging opportunity that you worked on, or I don't like to say worst just because it's negative, but for lack of a better term, like the worst sales experience you had and why it was bad, right? So that's how we like to start the discussion, and then we'll dive in from there.
Great. So we'll start with the good. Always love to start with the good. So
Yep.
really, one of the stories I'll tell is about a partner of mine. But before I do that, I want to define the term partner because to me that is fundamentally different. Suppliers can be partners or they can be vendors, and that defines the relationship we have with them. Some vendors and a distinct few of my vendors were truly partners. And what differentiated the partners was how transparent and how collaborative they were during challenging times. So, everyone goes, oh, we're not going to have a problem. Everyone has sunny day scenarios, et cetera. There's almost always some hiccup along the road, whether it's in the sales process or shortly after. And the ones that were partners were the ones that just rolled up their sleeves and helped through that process. And they did it with the goal of resolving the issue, not of selling me more service or software. So to me, this partner that I'll describe had an innate way of, just focusing on problems and helping me solve them. And of course, he was motivated to sell and sell services, but he had a great technique and learned early on that my habits, right? So I was an early bird, in the office at my desk early because I loved the quiet and I could catch up on the day before it caught up on me. Well, he learned my MO, right? And once or twice a week, he'd swing by with a Dunkin' Donuts coffee exactly as I liked it and just poke his head in and say, hey, I got your coffee. You have a couple minutes. And we would just, shoot the breeze about what was going on. And I would say 50% of the time we came on something I was struggling with. And of course, he offered to help if he was able to. And it led to an expanded partnership. And you didn't feel like you were being sold because you weren't. And to this day, I could never differentiate whether he was a friend or whether he was a supplier or partner, right? The lines were completely blurred. We would see each other socially, and it was really just about, you know, how he could help me solve the problems I was facing in my current experiences. So to me, that technique has stuck with me on how you can, the best sales experiences are the ones that you're not pushing, but someone's pulling, right? They're seeking guidance, they're seeking solutions, they're seeking help, and you can put yourself very easily in a position to do so with the right approach. So that's one of my kind of winning techniques that I've seen across my career. I and part of that technique comes from incredible listening skills, right? I've seen salespeople who ask you that question of how's everything going? You facing any issues today, whatever, and they're so ready to follow on with how we can solve it when they really missed what I was describing as the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And early in my career, I learned from a great boss. She said there's two types of people you'll experience in this world. Those that, listen intently and speak. And then there's those who speak and then wait to speak again. There's that gap. They're not listening. They're not paying attention. They're just waiting their turn to speak again. And, for me, I've been keenly aware of that ever since she taught me that. And it's very obvious. I see it all the time. People anticipate or guess what the question is and try and figure out how to respond appropriately, and they're missing the entire dialogue of the person they're speaking with. So, those two things are incredibly important to me. And one of the things that candidly I pride my career on is listening intently to people when they speak. I use this analogy all the time. It's almost like ringing in too early in Jeopardy, right? You don't get the full context, but you have to answer. And it puts themselves in a very disadvantageous position because either they make a fool of themselves because they're answering the wrong question, or they're not addressing the problem and they don't seem relevant or real.
Interesting. So I have a question about that because what you're saying is so important. It acknowledges the fact that there's different levels of relationships. So you could have that partner or advisor at the very top of the pyramid, and you can have the people who are very capable subject matter experts, but not necessarily ever rising to that level of partner. And I've always believed that it's the client who determines how high that's going to go, because there are certain clients that will keep you just at arm's distance. You could be doing everything right and you're never going to be their partner because that's not what they're looking for. But when you were talking, I had this impression that there are some people who could be partners, but they're not going to be from a conscious decision you made. First of all, check me on that if that does happen, because I had a sense that there are times that happens. And then, what's the thought process in your head if that is in fact true?
Well, it's a great question, Rob, and I think to me the can you earn the right to be a partner is all about, do I think you're on my side and we're driving toward a mutually beneficial situation, or are you looking to tell me I must have a nail because I'm selling a hammer, right? And I know nobody intends to be that transparent, but it really does come away from a buying perspective. It comes away as being um, very superficial and very not focused on my issues. You have a bias, and we all have biases. How well do we put them away when we're firefighting or problem solving is an interesting debate. So I'll riff on that same example of that seller. We had a unique hardware error that required a component to be replaced. It was nowhere around. We were down and we had an emergency. Not only did he figure out we had the problem, he found the component we needed, met the airplane at 2 a.m. for an air shipment coming in, and drove it to the location to be implemented or installed. that's someone who didn't have to do any of that. Not my job, right? That's an easy answer. How do you not consider that person a partner? And to me, they earn the right to be a partner, but it's mutual, right? Because I certainly would afford him references. I would do anything to support his business because he did the same for me.
I love it. And that speaks to, there was a book called Getting Partnering Right, and they talk about there's three components to an enduring relationship. You nailed it, mutually beneficial, common sense of purpose are two of the big ones, and obviously trust. But that common sense of purpose you described beautifully. So thank you for that.
Of course.
And I really like what you said, Dion, not pushing but pulling. And it's really interesting because I've worked in 7 different companies in my career where I worked for someone and saw the gamut from like rock star sales execs where he or she just did a great job, clients loved them, and then there were some ding dongs, right? The ones that did it wrong, and what's it take to put the software in your office today? It's like you don't say that kind of stuff. But that pulling versus pushing, it's very difficult to do from a sales standpoint, right? Because you've got your management team, go sell, Nate, get the deal. It's quarter end. It's the most important quarter in the history of the company until next quarter. But you have that push. So you have that push pull internally you're working with, and clients know it, right? I mean, and somebody told me years ago, and this is when I sold software, the software industry has done a great job of training clients to buy at the end of the quarter or at the end of the fiscal year. And I've had situations where one customer in particular made me wait until December 31st at 2:30 Eastern to give us the deal. And it was I won't get into the details, but we got the deal. It was all goodness and light at the end. But it was a painful experience on my part because I was sweating the oldies until that point in time we had the contract fully executed. But having it be a pull relationship versus pushing, it's things like that sales exec did where they went to the airport at 2 a.m., got the part because you guys were down and it was big trouble with China, fix it now. And they went above and beyond. And those are the types of people that you want to engage with because they've got your back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the push and pull, I found as when I flipped sides of the desk, right, and I was biz dev at my last gig, and the challenge was when I'm reestablishing connectivity to someone I've met or met through someone else, right? You describe what you do, you describe what's going on, and it goes back and forth. And somehow you find those opportunities to dovetail, right? Where the sale happens almost automatically. Now, that's not always the case, obviously, but how great is it when they go, I never knew that. And maybe we should look at that, right? And it's just an incredible conversation. The other thing I learned when I switched sides of the desk is, man, you guys have thick skin because there are some very challenging folks out there. And probably early in my career I was one of those. But when you get a polite response that even if there's no interest, at least you got it. There was a pulse there, and you feel like your outreach was received. So it has been really interesting in my career to have spent so much time on the buy side and then to switch to the biz dev side. And I did learn from the things I liked and didn't like on the buy side and leverage those extensively on the other. I didn't necessarily have names for it all, but I quickly connected the dots between what I had experienced on one side with the other.
Yeah, and for folks that are listening that might be newer into not only newer into sales, but newer into more strategic sales, which is bigger contracts, $1 million and up and such. That thick skin you talk about, you got to build it because you're going to get kicked in the teeth many, many times. And that's pretty much all sales, but how you react to it is really determines what happens longer term. And you don't win every deal, right? You have to go into it knowing that you're not going to win every deal. That's like baseball, right? The best hitters are like 300 hitters, which where I come from, 7 out of 10 times they don't get on base, right? So if you have that mentality going into it, and it's really not easy to do. And very honestly, it takes years to kind of develop that detachment mentality. But if you can detach from it mentally and say, look, it's not a reflection on me as a human. They're not rejecting me. They're rejecting what I'm, positioning to them. And also when you take that high road and say, hey, appreciate, the engagement, et cetera. If something should ever change, you go to another company, happy to re-engage, and take the high road, right? Don't try to bang on them. And the worst thing that a sales exec can do is when a customer says no, and you're trained and it's just beat into your head over and over, overcome the objection, right? And salespeople sometimes just pound and pound and pound, and that's not a good thing to do. It's good to understand why you're saying no, right? And what the reasons are, and say, hey, maybe there's something we should have done differently, or what have you. But like I said earlier, don't be a ding dong. Don't just pound the poor customer. Which, truth be told, I was guilty of it, right? I mean, because it's just part of the game, being persistent. But how you react to those losses, even more so today, because people don't stay at a company for forever anymore, right? You may
Right.
go from one company to another. And actually, Dion, when we worked together, you started at one company, went to two others. Fortunately for me, those companies were in my territory, and we were able to go to, three different companies. And then the people that were on your team, they went to a fourth company, which I also ended up selling, which was nice. And that's nice when you can not only have that relationship with a customer, but they know that, as you said, this other rep did a good job for you. They had your back, and you're much more comfortable engaging not only that company, but more so the person, because you feel very confident inside that if something's not a fit, they're going to tell you that, and you're able to part ways. Because it's not good to try to put a square peg in a round hole sometimes.
No, and I think you're right. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story on, the pounding you referred to. I was, I had a target. I was trying to engage a particular target who I had met quickly at an event. And it turns out we had a mutual acquaintance who I knew very well. And I asked him to facilitate an introduction for me. And nothing came of the introduction until finally I realized he had blocked my company's entire domain at his email server. So no email would get in from our domain. So I realized this and started sending him from my private email address. Was the only way I could communicate with him, because the company had pounded him so badly that he finally said no mas and turned it off. So that pounding can really have a detrimental brand image for you as an organization, because you don't take no. And these things are complex, and part of its relationship, part of its timing, part of its need. They're complex components that go into a good fit, and you cannot force those things without risking that alienation.
Mhm.
That's such a great point because your name on the caller ID is your brand. And when your company name shows up and they're thinking block or whatever, that's a bad place to be.
Yeah, and Interhall had predated me, and I always tried to be what I refer to as, exercise precision in how you want to engage a prospect. Don't shotgun it, use a rifle, be very precise, try and figure out the best door that you can knock on, and how can you best knock on that door. And if you don't do that forethought, you end up just barraging these people.
Yeah. I'm curious, how did you determine that he had blocked the whole domain?
He told our mutual friend, I've never gotten an email from him. And I'm like,
Ah,
I know I sent them. And then I went back through the CRM and realized that we had pretty much pounded him. And I put two and two together and tried one from my personal Gmail account, and he responded like that.
that's
You know,
great.
I have to share something. This popped into my head when you said don't shotgun it, do a rifle approach. Um, that's how I would actually talk to customers when we were engaged. And to the point that when I interviewed with a company years ago, he's like, well, tell me how you prospect. And I said, you know what, man? I said, you got your marketing team that's sending stuff out, just from an awareness standpoint. And I said, I don't like to use the shotgun blast approach. I like to do the rifle shot approach, and plus I'm a hunter in my personal life. So it relates to me from that standpoint. And he's like, well, how do you mean? And I said, well, when I try to engage a specific company, do a ton of research, try to find out something that, is going on where it's going to relate to what we're doing, and get that customer to actually respond. And it's kind of like in your personal life. It's like dear insert name. You can tell when you get one of those emails or texts or something. And I said, so when I prospect, I may not have the volume of dials or whatever, as we used to call them back in my 1990s ADP days, where you make dials and all that stuff, and it was more hard transactional type thing. It's more of a rifle shot to get a specific message to that person, and then you either get them engaged or they say, hey, you know what, it's not a fit because of XYZ reasons. And it's a balance, obviously, right? Because you got to have the activity, get the customers engaged and such. And it was funny because this guy that I was interviewing with, he goes, That's the exact opposite of how we do it with our marketing team. And we just send as much stuff out as possible. And I was kind of thinking, well, I get it. You got to do that from an awareness when you're in a more of a startup type phase. But, for me personally, I never really like that just because it's very hard to be unique in those types of, prospecting efforts. But like I said, it's a balance. You have to, the more people you contact, the better off you're going to be from a sales standpoint with respect to having 4 or 5 times your quota and pipeline and all that good stuff, which it sounds like you learned about that for a
I
period
did.
of time there most recently. So, but yeah, good call on don't shotgun it.
And one of my favorite shotgun stories on the buy side was, you know, there you get an email from a software supplier, and you're already using the products they're trying to sell you, and you're just like, do you need to buy a CRM or what? How did this happen? And it invariably, and these are not small companies; these are large companies with probably complex sales organizations. But I always used to laugh, going, you can't. And I would just send it to the rep that I had and say, you guys know who you cash all our checks. How could you not know who we are? Very it doesn't bode well for the confidence you have in those particular people when they do that shotgun, because again, Rob, you said it, it's your brand, right? When you're reaching out either as a domain on an email or on a caller ID, it is your brand you're standing behind.
Yeah, and I forgot the exact term, Dion, but I mentioned this to a colleague we interviewed recently, and it's a Navy SEAL term, and the term goes something to the effect of your smell shows up long before you do, which I thought was a great term because you think about it. Well, oh man, Nate's calling me. I got to take this. I'm taking it at the end of the day, so it's the last thing I have to deal with. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like that standpoint, which I always like that term, and I may be butchering the actual term that they use, but it was something to that effect where your reputation shows up long before you do, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Whether you like it or not, how you roll is going to show up, and people know it, right?
yeah, for sure. And you touched on you researching a company before you would engage them, and on the buy side, I would, I'm running from meeting to meeting, and I sit down for a meeting with a supplier. I'm going to learn about their company and their offering, and they want to spend the first 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 15 minutes learning about me. They want to know about my company. They want to know about what's going well, how are the recent financials. I'm like, I'm here to learn about you. You're not helping me. And I understood more when I switched sides of the desk why they do that, and it makes perfect sense. But I found doing that research up front gave me on the selling side the ability to tease out what I needed through dialogue instead of a download from whoever I was talking to. So, you could easily say, I researched your recent earnings results. You had some challenges here, and you hit some out of the park over here. Can we elaborate a little bit on how we're addressing that? And it's then a back and forth instead of a tell me everything I need to know as a seller, which is just, it used to drive me crazy when I would sit down, hurried to learn about a particular offering, and have to spend the majority of my time telling them what was either readily available or what certainly I already knew. And I gained a better appreciation switching sides, but I still think there's a nuanced technique that drives better results.
Yeah, for sure. And the more research, it's like anything else, the better prepared you are going into the discussion, whether it's a negotiation or, a first time meeting a customer, um, the better off you can kind of relate your solution to what they're going through, right? And
Yeah.
that research you do on the front end, I used to kind of say I'd research the dickens out of somebody before I even had a call, like an hour and a half. I mean, I spent an hour and a half. Things are easier a little bit now with AI and such that everybody's using and such. But, back in the day, you had to do some digging to find out what's going on. And what I found a lot of times those initial discussions were 30 minutes. So if you can't get a hook in 30 minutes, you're out, right?
That's right. And you're right. AI, I used to have, a scripted series of questions that I would load into an AI model, and it would give me a profile of the company, the leadership, the strategies in IT, the strategies the company have had, what successes, what challenges had they faced. You still have to review it. You have to validate it. It could be dated. It could be a whole bunch of other things. But the legwork certainly got much easier. I always think today in the world of AI and the capabilities we have, everyone's transitioning a little bit from being, content creators to editors. You still have to do that part of it. And I would share that, what I used to call a workup on a particular prospect, with my team and the others engaged in the deal. And it was a great way of kind of, aligning on what we thought the organization had, what they needed, what challenge they faced. And it really did make those first interactions much more conversational and less push.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Well, and you
sure.
make a good point about the research too, because if you're going in asking factual questions, that's just a warning sign you didn't do your homework.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they know what should be available. And also, what may have been a little harder to figure out, right? Did you talk to somebody who knew somebody? Did you the amount you do, it always, in my experience, paid dividends. And I appreciated it when it went the other way. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and you never know what you're going to, if you actually took the time to research, you never know what you're going to find. I remember hearing a guy tell a story about how he went in he was interviewing with a company and he had done a bunch of research. And he said, he went into this one executive's office. He said, I got to ask you, I'm really intrigued about this XYZ project that you guys are working on. And the guy looked at him, he goes, how do you know about, he goes, that's top secret. How do you know about that? He goes, it's on your website. It's like some idiot content guy on their website just threw it up there, thought it was interesting. And the company had no idea it was there. I'm like, ooh.
That's amazing. Absolutely
Yeah.
amazing.
Not surprising though.
No, big companies don't necessarily always know what each other's doing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Dion, from a sales experience, maybe one that was a little more challenging. I don't, like I said, I don't like to say worse, but maybe one that was more challenging that kind of sticks out in your head. And what made it challenging, whether you were on the sales side or whether you were on the buy side? I'm just curious. Like, I'm sure you've had some doozies, right? You've been in different companies in a CIO role, and you've 100% guaranteed seen the gamut, right?
Yeah, and I'll start with one on the buy side for sure. And it was always kind of my poster child, because you have these plans, you think you do everything right, and then somehow somebody drops an M80 in the middle of the table somewhere along the line. We were picking an e-commerce solution for a very large market within the company I was working for. It was a huge deal. And we were in the final throes of selection, down to probably the last three, and we were doing detailed vendor demos. And we had all of our executives in on these discussions, right? Because it was a very large decision for the organization. And one of the finalists actually provided the same service for one of our smaller markets. So, like, great, if this could be synergistic, it would be awesome. Unfortunately, there were some challenges going on at that very moment with that e-commerce product in that smaller market. And I knew what was going to happen. Somewhere in the discussion early on, we'd get on the conversation about what's going on with that particular market, and we would never get through the demo, and we would never achieve what we had set out to do. So I grabbed the salesperson before the meeting. We sat down and I said, look, I know we're having a problem. You don't want to fix it because you think the problem's on me and I won't pay for it. I think the problem's on your side and you should fix it for free. But to preempt a challenge in the meeting we're about to go to, I will give you my firm agreement to, if you triage and solve this problem and it turns out to be me, I'll pay for it. If it turns out to be you, you're going to fund it. Seemed reasonable. He was agreeable. We're doing introductions. One of my peers says, hey, what's going on in that small market? I hear challenging news. This guy's boss said, we're not going to fix it unless you agree to pay for it. So a $2 million deal that was reasonably successful trashed a $10+ million deal because of that response. The meeting ended. We didn't want to hear it. We left.
Wow.
You know
And you
what?
even warned them.